welcome to this Nordic Council of Ministers event to discuss the future of food in the context of food security, rural development, biodiversity and climate change. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name's Carolyn Steele. I'm an architect who writes about food. I wrote a book called Hungry City a few years ago, looking at the way food shapes cities and through cities actually pretty much everything else. I think it's a very exciting event tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. I think there's a very interesting agenda here put together by the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is to use the concept of new Nordic food to create a platform for global dialogue about the way that natural, local, seasonal and sustainable food can really punch above their weight and talk about new ways of living, and not only in the Nordic regions but also all over the world. And I think it's very, very exciting tonight that we've got the chef Trina Hahnemann cooking with Brazilian ingredients, according to new Nordic food principles. So after listening to everybody talking for 2 hours, we have our reward on the roof with some fantastic and delicious food. And I've tasted some earlier, and I can promise you it's well worth waiting for. Anyway, so the issue here I think that we're going to address is how an understanding of the way we can eat that new Nordic food addresses can really give us a new insight into the potential of strengthening rural economies. And it's something that, for me as an architect, it's very interesting to talk about, because I came to food through the prism of cities, in a sense, really trying to understand how food has shaped cities through history. And in a sense, the relationship between agriculture and cities, which goes back 10,000 years, really to the dawn of what we call civilization, is absolutely fundamental to the way we live and also to any understanding of civilization. In fact, there's a fantastic quote I'd like to share with you by an English author called Douglas Adams, who said there are 3 phases that every civilization goes through. The first phase is survival, where the primary question is, how shall we eat? The second phase is inquiry, which is basically the question of why do we eat? And the final phase of sophistication is, where should we go for lunch? So I think it's very interesting. I do believe that you can really look not only at the question of society and civilization through food, but also really to the profoundest questions there are. I, interestingly, now for 12 years have been thinking about not only about food and how it shapes cities, but also about the relationship between food and life. And I've come to the conclusion that food is really the most powerful metaphor that we have for life. In fact, food as a metaphor approximates so closely to life that you may as well call it life. We have to eat living things in order to survive. And in fact, by eating, we take part in the global ecology. It's what links us most closely to nature. So it's very profound. But also it points up what to me is an essential paradox in the question of how to dwell. We're here in Rio, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about sustainability and what a sustainable lifestyle might be. It seems to me that food, probably more than any other prism, has the capacity to show us how paradoxical the issues that we face are. Because on the one hand, if you like, as humans, we have a set of needs that might be described as social. In other words, we need one another. And increasingly, we move to things called cities in order to be with one another. And that's, how we satisfy that set of needs. But on the other hand, we have natural needs. We need sustenance. We need food. And that comes from a thing that, if you like, for argument's sake, I would call nature, although, of course, we are part of nature, so it's a bit more complicated than that. But food really shows us that our needs as humans are paradoxical because as we get more increasingly urbanized, we move further and further away from our sources of sustenance. And I would say that, now globally, with the world becoming increasingly urbanized, something like 1.3 million people moving from the countryside to the cities every week, we face a real challenge in finding a new balance between urban life and the natural landscapes and ecosystems without which life is not possible. Now, as we know, food provision for the last 200 years or so has been denatured. This is the oil age. The oil age has allowed us to, if you like, apparently solve the problem of feeding cities. And it's very interesting, if you look at the history of food in cities, that it's at the point at which railways come along and then other forms of industrialization, that the profound link between cities and geography, which up to that point was extremely obvious, is suddenly lost. So industrialization emancipates cities from geography. It allows them for the first time to be built anywhere, any place, any size and shape, and so on. But the consequence of that is that people living in cities have become more and more removed, not only from the physical landscapes feeding them, but even any understanding or concept of the true value of food. And I think I would say, that the question that I was just identifying earlier on about, what is a good life, really does boil down to this idea of values. And if we think about food and the true value of food, not only in itself, but what it represents, so the people that produce it, the landscapes it comes from, the need to actually keep it coming, which is all about stewardship of the land and understanding of the land, rather than merely about producing a commodity in a mechanized way, is fundamental to really our entire value system. So if we've created an illusion of cheap food by externalizing the true costs of industrial food, that has profound implications for our value system as a whole, and I think that's very problematic. I would say overall, probably my approach to this, and I hope this is going to come out in the conversations we're going to have, I'm sure it will, is that food is profoundly linked to society. You can't discuss food in the absence of society. You can't discuss society in the absence of food. So we're really talking about a cultural phenomenon, and a hugely complex phenomenon as well, but one that I think food gives us an ideal opportunity to sort of see not only sort of how complexities are all connected, it's a very connective subject, but also to bring us back down to realities as well, because it's a very physical thing. The great thing about food is that everyone has a stake in it. So anyway, that's enough from me, I think, to start off with. And, I'm sure, as I say, these kinds of issues are going to come up with our wonderful list of speakers tonight. And to kick off the evening, I would like to invite to the stage Martin Lidegaard. It's wonderful he can join us, the Danish Minister for Climate, Energy and Building, who's going to tell you a little bit more about new Nordic food and the agenda of the Nordic Council of Ministers. Martin, welcome.
Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little late. It's a crazy time out and really sensible. And it's also a defining moment in the negotiations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for inviting me and thank you for taking the initiative. I am very happy, it's a pleasure on behalf of the Nordic Council of Ministers to welcome you all to this seminar. And as you all know, the aim today is to look into the future through a food lens. Any discussion whatsoever on sustainability must include our daily consumption and management of food. And over the last 10 years, an increasingly strong agenda has developed around the concept of new Nordic food. And as you probably know, the basic idea of new Nordic food is to develop a concept where focus is on diversity and seasons in the field of cooking, meaning that you use the raw materials that is there from nature's side, outside the door, and at the time of the year where you can actually harvest it without transporting it a very long time. Another basic concept of the new Nordic food also is that it tastes very good. So the green transition It's not something where you have to suffer from, but you actually can gain from it, and you can make even more delicious food. This is very important. And that is, I have to admit, not a new thing. But what is maybe new is the concept here has actually also the potential to give rise to renewed rural economic development, simply because increased demand for local food products can improve the economic conditions for rural development. And at the global level, development of, should I be closer? Oh, have you heard anything? Yeah? It was okay, you could hear me before as well, okay. Very nice of you to say that. But anyhow, the hope also is that new Nordic food could deliver something for the rural economy. Because the rural economy, both in developed and developing countries, actually causes many challenges. In spite of great differences between countries, to maintain a sustainable rural economy is a challenge. A sustainable rural economy encompasses other development aspects such as food security, gender equality, environmental protection, biodiversity, and energy security. And today, to cover all these aspects, we will hear from representatives of the Nordic countries, from Brazil, FAO, and Biodiversity International. All will add their colors to a bigger picture on the food we want for the future we want. Allow me also to take my opportunity to say a few words about food production and consumption from my perspective, which of course is the perspective from climate and energy. And both energy and climate is closely linked to this agenda. First, as you all know, food production is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. For the EU as a whole, 20 to 30% of the total greenhouse gas emissions stem from food production. The use of energy is important, but what is even more important is whether agricultural production is production of meat or production of plants. Animal production creates the greenhouse gases methane and laughing gas, which have a much more forceful impact on climate change than CO2. Actually, laughing gas is 296 times more potent than CO2 in terms of impact in the greenhouse gas layer. Eating vegetarian food instead of meat is still one of the safe advices to consumers who want to act climate-wise. But besides this obvious connection to climate and energy, another safe piece of advice is to avoid food waste. Let me just give you one example. A study by the University of Edinburgh showed that the 360,000 tons of milk wasted in the UK each year create greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to 100,000 tons of CO2. This is equal to the amount of CO2 emitted by 20,000 cars annually. Now, a third example on the connection between food, rural development, and energy and climate is the very difficult and still more complex interaction between energy production and food production. The background for this is, of course, that the prices of all commodities and all raw materials are increasingly dramatically these years. If you look at the 20th century, it's the story about decreasing raw material prices or commodity prices for 100 years. There were exceptions during the World War, there were exceptions during the oil crisis, but in general, the story about the 20th century is the story about decreasing prices of commodities. In the last 10 years, the first 10 years of our century, the increase of commodity prices have been higher than the decrease the whole 20th century. So today, ladies and gentlemen, the prices, the average prices of the global in the global markets of energy, food, metals, biomass, water are higher than the prices were in year 1900. And as we have actually become more than 7 billion people on Earth, since the global middle class is growing fast, and since the resources on Earth are depleting very rapidly, we can foresee that the prices of crops, either that go to energy or to food will increase. This leaves us with an even bigger task, and potential also. Now, if we manage to use food in the right way and to grow it in the right way and use the waste from food production in our energy production, we have a huge potential to both progress the green transformation of our society and at the same time push the development of economy in rural areas. If we do the opposite, if we are not clever, we risk to damage the rural development, to damage the fragile soil in many societies, and if we don't take care of the resources at the local areas and the local rural areas, we risk to make harmful development to these areas and doing irreversible damage to their economies. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is an exciting area. I will end by also making a quote, which I think is almost as beautiful as your quote. My quote is from the great author George Bernard Shaw, who once said, "There's no sincerer love than the love of food." And I think that sustainability should not stifle our love for food, but I know from personal experience that even waste can be turned into gourmet meals. So it's actually possible to maintain our love relationship with food in a resource-constrained world if we only allow ourselves to think out of the box and venture into new territory that may lay down just our doorsteps. And with this, I wish you all a very good evening and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to just let you know that Jacqueline McGlade, who the director of the European Environmental Agency, was going to be with us, but she has been summoned at the last minute to go and speak with the Brazilian president. So instead, we have Lars Mortensen to come and say a few words on her behalf.
Thanks very much. Actually, she is meeting with the Prime Minister of Bhutan right now.
Sorry.
And we could not compete with that. So, welcome everybody. Good evening. I'm pleasure to be here. I'm Lars Mortensen. I'm responsible for sustainable consumption production in the European Environment Agency, and I'm here in Rio to do two things: to be in the negotiations as part of the EU delegation, negotiating especially on sustainable consumption production, and also contribute to various events. And I'd like just to give you an EA perspective on the sustainability of food. Just show you a few graphs, and then I'd like to show you some pictures from a wonderful trip we had the other day just here outside Rio. So if you can just, I can go here. What is really important when we look at sustainability of food is to look at the whole chain, and that's what we talk about food, and we don't talk about agriculture. So to really make sure that you look at the whole chain from agricultural production through processing, distribution, retail, storage, what we eat, the dishwashing, and the waste. And as you can see in this overview I've made, we use energy, fossil fuels, water, etc. in the whole process, and we have emissions and pressures and waste coming out through that whole process. And I think it's important to have that in mind when you talk about the sustainability of food. In the EU, basically, we have made accounts that shows that eating and drinking accounts for a very large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. 16%, even more, 1/3 of the material use, and 1/3 of emissions of acidification substances. So we're talking about very, very large numbers, which is why it's so important to address food. We've just done some new accounts, actually, that where you look at, if you spend €1, what are the life cycle environmental pressures caused by that? And if you look at the materials used, if you spend €1, this is in Europe, food and beverages comes up as the one that has the highest material use. So it's the most important thing to look at from a sustainability perspective. I just want to show this graph as well. This shows carbon, material, and water footprint for different types of food. And this, the picture here that beef has the highest impact, and butter and cheese, and it goes down along from pork to chicken and into vegetables. And of course, the local apples and in season and fruits and vegetables in general is by far the best. And food, Martin also talked about food waste, an enormous issue. As you can see here, we just have made a graph that shows how much food is actually wasted, and the amounts it's just enormous. There are numbers around talking about 1/3. It's actually more through the whole chain that I showed in the beginning. It's much more than 1/3 of the food which is produced. We don't have a lot of numbers for a lot of countries, but the indications are that it's really a lot. Very much from households. Also a lot of things being wasted in the manufacturing processes and in the retail and catering, so it's everywhere. So food waste is probably the first issue we have to look at when we talk about food. So then I just wanted to say a few words about a wonderful trip we had the other day with Teresa and with Trine and others, and we went to Pedra Branca in Campo Grande, just here outside of Rio, which is one of the largest urban native rainforests in Latin America. And we had the most wonderful experience there that somehow changed my perspective on life, I think. This is us walking up the hill. What we did was we brought chefs out there, we brought politicians from European Parliament, we brought other policymakers, we brought scientists and others together with the local community, the local foresters. We brought a forester there, and we walked through this rainforest. And as we walked along, we had people picking the plants and experiences. So let me just, so here's the first picture. We're walking up the hill. So you're in the rainforest, just outside Rio, looking into the urban. So it's like, it's an urban rainforest, you could actually call it. And here we are back in the farm, actually all of us cooking together here. Here's Trine. Magnus, one of the very, very famous Swedish chef, Miles, who's a forester who sells plants to the best restaurants in the world, and my colleague Ulrike there. We were just cooking together, and the experience of learning how, basically, my experience was, why do we take land and cut down everything and plant one plant and then eat it? When we just have everything out there, we have the forests, and we don't, all these plants in there, often we don't know they're eatable. So in this whole exercise, we were actually able to teach some of the locals or some of the people there that, this thing that you give to the pigs is very good for humans. And they were able to tell us that, this thing you can actually eat it. And we're, wow. And I had the most wonderful juices I've had in my life of cabbage and all kind of thing. It was really amazing. And here we have all of us cooking and here are some of the locals. We had just had such a wonderful time. Here's this picture of the food we created. It was just so lovely. And the message from this is, I think we just have to, this is a picture taken from out there before we are going home. We really have to rethink the way we look at food and everything. So that's my message to you here today. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just very interesting that both Martin and Lars have mentioned two issues that I think are really sort of point up the kind of the degree to which the industrial and urbanized food paradigm has taken over and the problems with this. And you both mentioned increased meat consumption, which actually is sort of globally increasing at the same rate as urbanization. And I think that's something. When you consider that, for instance, I mentioned at the beginning that cities and agriculture co-evolved, and they did that because grain is actually the only food we've ever discovered capable of sustaining urban populations. So it's a real issue that if you like, the kind of the lowest common denominator sort of Western diet is now going global. And the other issue that you both mentioned is the issue of food waste, and of course waste. The fact that we waste food is directly related to the fact that we've created this illusion of cheap food. So I'd be very interested in getting your responses, where you think, your sort of transformative experience in the rainforest yesterday, Lars, sounds amazing, but, as we know, you can sort of walk out of an inspirational event like that and go pretty much anywhere, and you see the vast mainstream of food is still this kind of very carnivorous, wasteful diet. What would you say was sort of the key point at which ministers and agencies need to sort of really start addressing the global spread of this kind of diet?
Well, this time I have to switch this on before I speak, like this. Thank you. Even a politician can get professional. I think that all major transitions in human history, including the way we have now made our food culture, will rely on both political movements or political decisions, new regulation, and on new industries, practices, new productions, new innovations, and on consumption behavior and the choice of consumers. And probably one of the ways that to then start with the consumers and the industry themselves, what I really like about the new Nordic food concept is that it's smart. It's not only good and healthy and environmentally sound, it is actually delicious and smart. And that's how I think you can make a green transition, that it is even more attractive than what we do today. Instead of the idea about we have to live in caves and eat strange things all the time. So that's one way to go about it. Then, of course, as politicians, we have to consider very directly how can we actually regulate this so it becomes more easy to make the right choices as industry and citizens. And there you have a range of possibilities. I mean, of course you could tax your way through it. You could tax meat more heavily than you do today. And if there are no Danish journalists in the audience, I will also say that that could be a clever way forward, but I don't dare to say that as I can to my tax ministry because there are many problems connected to it.
Might
how
get
you
back to
assess
them.
it. Yeah, but you could do that if you want to do that. Just as important is that we, when it comes to the waste, find out how can we make a more efficient production to prevent waste, and the waste we can't prevent, how do we make more clever use of it? In energy production, for example, or recycling, or whatever you can. And I think today we have a far too simple way to deal with the waste we can avoid to have, like just burning it or throwing it away or compost it. I think we could do that much more wisely. So there's not one simple answer to a question. I think it takes a range of initiatives from both politicians and civil society and industry.
Thank you.
From my side, basically, what I think we are facing is that I think we're standing in the beginning of a whole paradigm shift in the food policy. I think because we see in the past we were always looking at agriculture, we were looking at quantities and etc. And I think shifting the focus away from only looking at agriculture to looking at food and the whole life cycle changes the perspective. It becomes more advanced and less simple, and I think that's really important. And the shift also from the quantities. I was in a meeting on food security recently, where with leading experts in the world, and what the leading experts are saying is that food security of the world is a distribution problem very much. It's very much a distribution problem and less of a quantity problem. And that means that and it's about health. So we should focus less on the quantity and less on the good quality stuff. We want to have more of the good things. It's really important. When we talk about economic growth, we want to have good economic growth and not bad economic growth. And of course about waste. The food waste is for many of us a wake-up call. We just have to deal with it, and it's not difficult, I think, because we've just become aware of it. There are many tools in place that we can easily address that very quickly. So what's the way forward? In my opinion, we're now in Rio. We are at Rio+20. There has to be an agreement on the night of Saturday, probably, hopefully, before we go home. And my very big hope is that there will be an agreement on a global framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production. And I'm working very much towards that, supporting the Danish government and others, because that will provide a global program that can enable a lot of these things. This has to be combined with government initiatives in different countries doing all these things, and then just all these local initiatives, and we just need to support that. We need seed money to get these things going. I think that would make an enormous difference.
Just one more question. I'm sort of going off piste already here because we didn't have a discussion session scheduled, but this is so interesting just from both of you. I mean, it's very heartening to hear that, you're in the middle of crucial, discussions, negotiations, and food is very much in the mix. Are you hopeful that in the next 3 or 4 days there's going to be some really concrete result in terms of sustainable food consumption and production, as you were saying?
Shall I will start this time. Yes, I am very hopeful. I sincerely believe we will have an agreement. I think because we cannot be sure, the negotiations are going on, but I think a lot of countries are coming together, from developing countries and rich countries, all come together and agree. There are some, or in particular one country who's not so keen, but I do think and I do hope that we come to an agreement on adoption, and I hope that Martin and others of the high-level people are successfully in closing the deal before we go home.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I hope the best, but I do fear the worst, because it's quite tough right now. It is a very strange thing that I was in Rio 20 years ago as well, a young hopeful student at that time, and it seems to me, and I have also had the chance to participate in many climate negotiations and many COPs. Whenever you go into a room and you have to find binding targets, or kind of something you can assess, or the environment of negotiation gets very hostile, because it becomes very easily a question about burden sharing, historic responsibility, who to take what. I don't know exactly why it is like this, but there's a kind of negative dynamics in the negotiations. Whereas when you jump out of these negotiations room into conferences like this, or NGO or business things. I was earlier this morning to a green fashion conference, like we have this on food, and there's so many initiatives where people look at this green transition as something that benefit not only the environment and the future generations, but also our generations, also our way of living, becoming more healthy, having these beautiful experiences, and there's a lot of dynamic and positive. Same countries, same ministers, same people, but just another setup where the whole logic and framing is completely different. And these events leave you with a lot of hope, and I see enormous energy and driving in this. If we manage to get these two worlds to meet more frequently than they do, or I don't know, find the right approach to merge this thing, we might end up with a good result. There are some good signals, though, in the text, but I think there is a long way to what we hope for, at least from the EU side right now.
Fantastic. Well, many thanks indeed for joining us. Very much appreciated, and good luck. We're all with you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, that was very interesting to get an insight of what's going on in the kind of the Rio Central, as it were. And I think after that great beginning, I'd love to sort of just get actually more stuck into the feel-good factor that Martin was just referring to. And I think our first three speakers are really going to do that for us. I have to confess that I've been a little bit sort of... I've played a bit fast and loose with the published schedule that you've all got. This is actually a request from two of the chefs that are about to speak to you, that maybe they could have, or two of the people that were going to speak in the first session, that maybe they could have a chef that was going to speak later speak with them. So I'm going to change the order around, which is going to play havoc with my name places, but we'll do our best. So, in the first, by the way, I mean, just the structure of this evening, which I've already, as it were, contravened, but I thought that was extremely interesting to have a quick discussion there with Martin and Lars. There are three key sections. The first is going to be talking about the new normal, how we can create a cultural shift to produce consumer demands and make this a driver for change. In the second session, we're going to be talking about how we can move on from those consumer-driven demands to a new appreciation and understanding of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And then in the last session, we're going to talk about how both of those things can contribute towards creating sustainable food societies. And we'll have, after each session of speakers, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I will throw it out to the audience at that point. So the first of my sort of shuffling of the deck, I'd like to invite the first three speakers, which are to come and join us on the stage, if you all would please. Trina Hahnemann, who I just introduced as the wonderful inspirational chef and food writer and creative director of Trina Hahnemann. And thank you very much. And Ms. Lia Poggio, who is recently come from Italy and is the director of Slow Food Brazil. And reaching down into my deck here, thank you very much, is Teresa Corthon. Is that Corthon? Okay, is that close enough? And Teresa is going to talk about her work for the Instituto Maniva, of which she's the founder director, and her work getting more, and I'm sorry, can I pass you your name, Teresa? Getting more recognition for local foods such as manioc in Brazil. Anyway, in that order, if I could invite, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. So first of all, Trina Hahnemann, director of Trina Hahnemann, and as I said, chef and food writer. Trina.
Yes, it's working. Right? Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming. As you see here, it's a landscape with some lovely geese taking a walk in nature. And this is Denmark. It's a very flat country, and this is an organic farm. So this is the way it should look. This is food, this is nature, this is beauty, this is biodiversity, and this is where I get my produce from, one of them, but this is kind of the frame where I work from. First, I want to say that sustainable cannot be a choice. It has to be embedded in any decision or thing that we do in our everyday life. And the way that I see it is that you have to look at your own profession and think, how can I do that, what I work from? Because that's probably one of the easiest ways where you can enable change, when you can't do everything. So, and I'm a chef, and therefore I cook. And I have to source things, and I have to think about my responsibilities as a chef, as a cook, but also as a home cook, everything that has to do with food. But as Carolyn mentioned, as soon as we start talking about food, we also start to talk about life and the way we want to live, and society and everything. Food is so connected to that whole discussion. I think, do I do it right? No, yes, something happened. So, what you can see here in the background is rye. Rye is a beautiful, beautiful grain that grows really well in the Nordic hemisphere, and it's a very, very big part of the Nordic diet. And I want to talk a little bit about why the new Nordic food is a sustainable solution, and why it has come up with a very interesting frame to work with this in a local communities. Oh. All right. Yes. First of all, we need polycultured farms, which means we should not have farms that only breed one thing or grow one thing. It has to to protect the diversity in the soil and all of that. We need seasonal produce, we need local farming, organic farming, radical transparency, reduced waste, fair trade, and I could go on and on. But this is some of the very important issues that you should look at when you are a chef. And I actually think that the new Nordic food movement is providing these things inside the movement. And why is that? That is because we have looked at our way of eating. We have looked at our food culture and found out we were losing it and importing all kinds. I mean, in the 90s, we would eat so many fruits from Thailand, and they tasted of absolutely nothing. It's completely ridiculous. They cost a fortune, they're shipped around the world, and we can't taste them anyway. Why would we want to do that? Why don't we eat apples and plums and all the beautiful, wonderful things we grow where we live? And there were some chefs who started talking about, yes, that could be a way. So I can't tell you, it's like the hen and the egg. Was it the chefs that started asking the farmers for it, or was it the farmers who started showing the chefs what they could do? But a very, very beautiful collaboration started. And from there, the last 30 years, a movement has grown. And at the same time, it has been local, but it has also been organic. Denmark is still have every year a rise in organic consumers buying more and more organic food, even though we have a crisis, which I see as a very positive sign. It is also, sorry. It is also very important to talk about joy and food at the same time. Food has to be joy. It has to taste good. That is the way we can get people to the table to do it in a different way. I mean, I could take one movement. In the 70s, we had a vegan movement with a lot of not very good tasting food, a lot of beans that nobody wanted. I mean, we can't change people like that. We have to lure them in to something that's really lovely and tasty. And I want to show you one of the projects in Denmark that is part of the new Nordic movement and kind of moving this, which is moving this ahead, not only with their produce, but also because their whole place is such a beautiful, sustainable farm where biodiversity and all the things I talked about before is the same. Susanne Simonsen, who inherited this farm when in 2006, it was a conventional farm, and everybody told him, don't go organic. You can't do it. This is will be the biggest turnover of an organic farm ever in the Danish history. And she went around all of Europe and visited other organic farmers and talked to people in Germany, in France, in England, and got inspired and made the decision, even though everybody said to her, don't do it, it can't be done. And she created an organic farm. And her accountant said to her, the best thing you could do, you have 4 employees, is to fire the 2 of them and then just go on as you always done. And now she has this beautiful farm. She has 24 people working there. She's doing some of the best cheeses in Denmark. She's won prizes in France and Italy. And that's a hard thing for a Danish cheese. I mean, really. And she's been invited into the French Cheese Guild as the first Danish farmer ever. I mean, they came down with the hoods up to Denmark and swore her in and everything. I mean, it's a tremendous honor. So she's a sign, but the other thing she's done is she's created in the outskirts of Denmark, some would say, I wouldn't really, because it's very near Germany, so it's near Europe, you can talk about that for a long time, but she's created a lot of workplaces. She has created new economics. She has now employed more people, and she has worked extensively to recreate the biodiversity in her area and is still working on it. If you ever go to Denmark, drive down and see them, and you can walk around. It's an open field. They love to have guests. So now I try again. Okay, I do like this? Okay, good. Next example that I want to show you is Skærtofte Mølle. It's in Als, a little island in Denmark as well. Started to do their own flour 8 years ago. Another wonderful, wonderful organic product that created jobs where they are. A product that all the best restaurants in Denmark work with. You can buy it. There's flour and grains, and you can buy the products in supermarkets. And tonight, when we go to the terrace, there will be 2 salads, one with barley and one with rye, that comes from this company. I couldn't bring the cheese all the way over to Brazil, I'm sorry, so you have to come to Denmark to taste that. And this is another example of this whole thing I'm talking about. Chefs wanting to have real good products and farmers providing it, but staying where they lived. And, you know, actually creating a community where they are. And that's where the things about chefs having that responsibility, because that is giving the fancy restaurants are in city, and then you have the farmers outside in the rural areas, and that collaboration can make something really beautiful happen, so not everybody has to move in and do all the same things. Noma, of course, has been #1 restaurant in the world, and that has meant a tremendous lot to this movement. This movement is also in Sweden and Norway and Finland. So many beautiful projects, you're going to hear some of them tonight, is going on. And so, but I just want to point out, this is not a restaurant movement. This is not just for foodies. This is about empower your food culture and look for what is possible where you live locally. And I just want to show this because this is a traditional Danish dish called biksemad, but it's just, usually it was leftover food, and instead of just having leftover food, this is a reinvention, which is like what the new Nordic is. You look at the tradition, and then you create something new, and this is with vegetable and a poached egg, left out the meat, because we also have to cut down on the meat. So that is the showing of, you take your food culture, you look at it, and then you look into all these issues that I talk about, and with that, you try to reinvent it and involve it in your tradition. And so how is this an idea? How is New Nordic an idea that you can implement around the world? It is, because this is, you go talk to the chefs, like we're going to hear today, what I've experienced in Brazil, even though I've only been here for 4 days, and you look at the tradition and you help each other reinvent this. And we have bread here. Bread this is a rye focaccia, and this will be on the roof terrace as well. I brought the flour with me, and a little bit, and there's some Brazilian flour in there as well. And this is like the main diet of the Nordic countries, rye. This is what we should eat, because it grows really well where we live. Here in Brazil, they don't have wheat, and but they all of a sudden eat a lot of bread, but they have manioc, which can be used to a lot of the same things where they should celebrate. And Therese will talk much more about that, but it's the same story. You could go to any place in the world and look at their food culture, look at what they grow, and then start having that movement. And from my perspective, this is a big responsibility that chefs has to look at. How am I with time?
Good.
Okay, sorry. I don't have a watch.
Brazilian time.
Brazilian time, okay. The other thing that I think the New Nordic movement is also looking at, and actually if you go to some of these really, really fancy, very expensive restaurants, you won't be served a lot of meat. There's very little meat compared to what it used to be when you had like fish, meat, and the 3 courses. In the future, I believe the planet has to eat like this. 80% can come from vegetables and grains, and 20% from animals. And that goes for milk, cheese, butter, fish, all of it. That means a tremendous change of diet. And it can be done, and it can taste absolutely wonderful. And I have proven it to you tonight, so please stay and taste it. This is really, really important that we issue that. We cannot have so much, we cannot eat so much meat. I mean, and keep doing it and have millions, billions of people who want to change into that diet. And why should we? We have only eaten this much meat for like 50, 60 years. I mean, it's kind of weird that is just a given now, that we can't discuss that. I mean, if you look at the whole history, it hasn't been like that. There's been lots of other ways of eating. So, but I also think New Nordic diet is also is showing that, is showing a way for that, because what we have done is we've looked at lots of the vegetables, especially the root vegetables, and a lot of the local fruit, and then we have put that into our diet. So celeriac is not kind of our gold of the soil. We have all the root vegetables are now sold in supermarkets around Denmark, and it is like that. And if you go to other parts, like in the southern parts of Sweden, there's a lot of small producers who are also having so many new local vegetables. I would say that it's a bit more difficult in Norway because they don't have as many farms with the same kind of variety in vegetables as we have is in the other areas. And then we have the other issue, of course, local. The new Nordic food movement is local. And I think it's wonderful that these Magnus, who has this wonderful restaurant up in the north of Sweden, and that Noma and other restaurants is only having this concept of really, you can only eat what is local. We only cook for local, and February is really, really tough, but we do it because they show an example that is really, really wonderful. But I don't believe personally that's the way we should eat in our households. And also because history has told us we can't isolate it like that. We need to trade with each other. That is part of the way the world goes. We have too many wars if we don't, so that's that whole issue. But I think as chefs, we have a very important responsibility to look at that. So what I recommend is we do 60% local, which means grains, meat, vegetables, and all the things that shouldn't be shipped around the world, fruit, and then we eat really, really seasonal. And then, of course, and I live in Denmark, and I can't live without coffee, tea, spices, red wine, even though I love beer and we have beer. And so of course, lots of places in the planet, there's things we would like to trade with that can be put on ships and go really slowly around the world, and then we can have it where we live. So I would say the new Nordic model is have all these things that I showed you as part of it. And that is, in a lot of different levels, create biodiversity, new rural economics, seasonality being celebrated, and so on and on. And in the end, it creates an opportunity and a joy that we can all go and sit around tables and eat wonderful food and exchange our stories, which I think is the core of life. I just want to say, please stay and come with us to the roof terrace and enjoy the beautiful view of Copacabana and try this 80-20 of local organic produce that I have found here in Brazil and made a Nordic Brazilian buffet out of. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Trina. If I could invite Leah Poggio to talk to you about the good, clean and fair, a slow food perspective.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the floor and for inviting Slow Food to be part of this interesting discussion. Slow Food is an international grassroots organization that sees gastronomy as an instrument for social inclusion and social and environmental transformation. And Slow Food now is present in more than 170 countries. It's something like an eco-gastronomy organization. And we follow, for example, the things of one American farmer that is called Wendell Berry, that he said that eating is an agricultural act. So Slow Food is basically aims to preserve the farming biodiversity, to promote local food chain production, to add value to the tradition and food heritage, to empower the small-scale food production, and to promote the social inclusion, to empowerment of the women and the young generation. So we believe that the food that we eat must be good, clean, and fair. Good because of the taste of the food should be good. And we think also that everyone has the right to access a good quality food. Then we also think that the food must be clean. So because we really need to preserve our environment. And for that reason, we are also fighting against food waste, that at the moment is one of the most important things that we have to deal with. And after that, we also think that our food must be fair. That means that we have to add value to the work of our small-scale food producer, because they really need to receive the right price for the work that they do every day. And so the Slow Food is realizing different activities, but basically we are trying to intensify the agroecology and sustainable food production system. We are trying to support the small-scale food production. We are trying to preserve our food heritage, the recipe, the local food tradition. And we are trying to do that all over the world. And as Carol Steen said a few minutes before, I'm Italian and I am the director of Slow Food in South America, but I recently moved to Brazil and now I'm based here in Rio. I feel that I'm really very lucky because it's a really beautiful and amazing city. And we decided to open an office here because we think that Brazil has a very huge and interesting biodiversity, farming biodiversity. There are a lot of different interesting products. And since the 2004, Slow Food was working in collaboration with the MEDA. It is the Ministério de Desenvolvimento Agrário, it's the Ministry of Development Agriculture, that was still working together with the Ministry of Agriculture, but is trying to support and to deal with the small-scale food production. So it's trying to help local food producers, the family agriculture, as the Brazilian call it. And so we start to work together with this ministry and other ministries, like, for example, the Ministry of the Culture and other organizations of the civil society, the Brazilian ones, in order to mapping local interesting products, to add value to the small-scale producer, and to identify Arcostazo Presidia products, so the kind of product that really are identifying and are part of the gastronomy heritage of this huge and beautiful country. And we work, for example, with the in the network, and we are trying to build a network and international one, but we are also trying to develop the network locally. For example, we are doing it here in Brazil, because we are trying to establish connection within the different people that are involved in the food production or consumptions, like producer, cooks, and students, academics. And so we are trying to promote the discussion about food, because we also think that we really need to rethink about the way how we are looking on food. And also we have a deal now, so we really have to give an opportunity to the young generation. So we have to give to them the instruments to continue producing the local food. And Slow Food is based now here in Brazil, but we are working now especially for the Rio+20 UN conference. And 4 months ago, when we were starting to think about what Slow Food can do during this conference, we decided to do something really active in practice. And so we decided to help a group of small-scale food producers that are living in the mountains, very close here from the city. We were, looking on the different markets, the food markets here in Rio de Janeiro, and we were very surprised on this discovering that in a huge and big city like Rio de Janeiro, with 6 million people living here, there are only 10 small farmer markets. And so we think that maybe should be a good opportunity to try to promote this market during the Rio+20 conference. That's because, our aim is really to support the local sustainable food change. And we thought that maybe to support this kind of experience and activities that many people are doing here in Rio should be a a good choice for us. And for example, today I went to the Rio Center, is the venue of the UN conference. And I was really very, surprised and disappointed at the same time, because I went to the food cart, and unfortunately I saw that there were only the fast food restaurant there. There is only one vegetarian restaurant, it's kind of vegan, but was interesting because it was owned by a group of young people, and so there was a space for the young generation too, and I think that is really very important and interesting. But the rest of the restaurant were like something like, Bob's, that is the Brazilian version of McDonald's, things like that. There was the Tex-Mex, and all this kind of fast food. And I really feel, Slow Food really thinks that maybe the UN conference about sustainable development should be the place where we can discuss about, food security, about nutrition, but it's also the place where we really need to show what this means in practice. And so maybe for the next conference, the organization should include few restaurants that are now dealing with small-scale producer, because this really not makes sense. Also because, during this, I recently moved here in Rio de Janeiro, but I had the opportunity to meet a lot of very interesting people like Teresa and other chefs here in Rio that are starting to use local products in their menu. And this is really something really very interesting. And so we decided also to make a guide that should be given to all the delegates of Rio+20 with the list of restaurants, bars, farmers markets, and also social project linked to the food and food production and consumption, just to give to the people that are coming here from all over the world, that is starting here in Brazil, a really very interesting movement about new kind, we can say, a new kind of food based on our food heritage, based on our local product. And we really think that we have to act, to demonstrate to people that there is another way, as an alternative way to deal with food. And maybe conferences like this one are the best place to do that. But for sure that we have to do that every day, in our life. But we were really, really very surprised today. But as I told you before, one of the slow food activities during, the big and huge conference in these days is to support the work of the small-scale producer coming from the mountains here in Rio, for the region. And they are now present in the city with the 6 small farmers markets. And we decided to be there this week and to try to promote, to talk with the customers, because it's really very important to change our habits about food consumption. And so we decided to be there tomorrow in Ipanema, and on Thursday in Tijuca, and on Saturday in Bairro Peixoto e Jardim Botânico. I really would like to invite you to be there, because I think that it's really very interesting experience, and we really have to promote that. Also because there are a lot of interesting experience of urban agriculture, of a social project linked to the food production and consumption. And so we really think that if you can promote it, maybe things can change, slowly. And I think that it's very important to think that food is really culture, food is memory. And so we really have to think about and how we we eat, and especially what we eat. And it's also very important to make the consumers more responsible, because it's very important what they choose. And so we think that it's very important to start to promote a different way to produce and to consume food.
Could I ask you to wrap up, please, Leah? Because could I ask you to wrap up, because time.
Okay, and so I will distribute a copy of the guide to all of you, and I hope that should be useful for the day that you will stay here in Rio de Janeiro. Because I think that it's a very, very good opportunity that you have to know a little bit more about the Brazilian cuisine and the Brazilian food. And there are a lot of interesting young chefs and a lot of social projects that are really interesting and really need to be, promoted and to well known here in Brazil, but all over the world.
Thank you very much indeed. And now, Teresa.
Hello. A little bit taller than... Well, following Leah, my story starts in a slow food event. I'm a chef. I have a restaurant in Rio for the last 30 years. I come from a family that all the women were very good cooks. So we always put many different people at the table, and that sounded really difficult to do because in Brazilian families were large families. And I always fell in love with cooking because it can bring people together, and also it can create things and transform things. So I was a chef, I already had the restaurant, and I was invited to go to this slow food event in Portugal. And in this event, they gave prizes to some projects of food and sustainability. And I was that really changed my life, because before that, I didn't know how powerful cooking was, how powerful food choices could be, and how could make a difference for so many people. It really could be like a social revolution, depending in which side you were. But I wanted to talk about two little stories. I came back to Brazil after this slow food event, and then I was really thinking about this. How can a cook make such a difference? And then I was invited to make this festival, like cooking festival in the northeast of Brazil. And when I was there, people always do the same. They think the chefs are really magical people. They can cook better than the local cooks, which is a lie. And then when I went there, they gave me this big list of northeastern Brazilian food. And half of it I didn't know about. And I was really ashamed of that. And then I started asking people, what is this? And they say, this is manioc. This comes from manioc. And I said, okay, this one, manioc. And the third one, manioc. So half of the list were manioc subproducts that I didn't know. And that really struck my mind at the time. So I tried to do some food with the things I didn't know about, and then they didn't come out very well. So the next day I was in the breakfast at the hotel, and I saw this lady making these little crepes from manioc at the side. And everyone know about this food. Everyone eats this food when they go to the Northeast, but they never speak about it for some reason. So I went to the lady and said, what's your name? She said, Maria, and said, listen, Maria, could you help me? Because I'm supposed to make some special food with this stuff, and I never saw that before. Is that a flour? She said, no, that's not a flour, that's a starch. I said, okay, where this comes from? And she said, that comes from the manioc house. And I never heard that word before. I didn't know what a manioc house was. So there I was in front of a normal and very humble cook, and she was telling me about something of my own country that I should know and I didn't know. And I think that moment was like this, one of these moments of life when you really, your life makes a shift. And then I cooked something, she taught me how to do it, and some of you ate it yesterday at the cocktail. And then I came back to Rio. In my kitchen, I have about 7 people that comes from the northeast of Brazil. And then I asked them, listen guys, do you know about the manioc house? And they all stopped, and they looked at each other and said, of course we do. Every northeastern person in Brazil were born in a manioc house. And I said, how come? So they start telling me stories about the manioc house, the place where the manioc is processed into so many different products. And while they were talking, they start sharing so many experiences, so many remembrances, so many family stories. And I was like this shrinking cartoon effect, like I'm getting smaller and smaller in a corner of the kitchen. And I said, how can I not know these things? And not only me, many Brazilian chefs. So I said, why didn't you tell me about this before? And they said to me, because it makes us sad. Because it's our past, and our past is poverty. So I start understanding that that food, so important for all those very poor people, was always connected to poverty. So I start rehearsing that like crazy. They said to me, you must go to a manioc flour house now, get a plane and go. And I start really rehearsing that and finding so many manioc people in Brazil. We are like a network, crazy manioc people. And then someone in US invited me to make a speech about manioc, because from now on I became known as the manioc chef.
Maniac.
Manioc maniac. The manioc maniac chef. So I went to, going to US and to talk about manioc, I said, I must do something very visual. So I did this small documentary about how to make a manioc flour. And I asked some people of the Manioc Maniac network, what's the best place for shooting a documentary like that? What's the most beautiful manioc house place? And she said to me, Amazon, of course, because manioc is the staple food of the indigenous people. All the indigenous people in Brazil, from northeast, west, east, they ate manioc. Actually, wheat only came with the Portuguese. Before that, all the staple, the carbohydrate we ate was manioc. So I said, which place? And she said, Pará. I said, okay. So I got to this place with my ex-husband, and then we start shooting with this guy, and we asked him to make step by step, from taking the root out of the earth until the end. And the film was going to be called The Manioc Water Flour of Manioc. Manioc water flour. Because I was focused in the product. I wasn't thinking about the people. And then, while that very, very clever guy, that now is a manioc celebrity because of slow food, while he was working, he started talking about his life. His life was manioc. And then he said, one of the shootings, he says, because I do this and that, I am the manioc flour professor. And then when I saw that, I said, that's the name of the film, The Manioc Flour Professor. So we got back to Rio, we edited the film, we took to US. When we showed the film in US, everyone at the front row were really, really emotional about it once the lights turned on. And I said, that's strange. Americans' emotion because of a manioc flour professor. And then, at the same time, we sent the film to him. And the same maniac friend told me, send the film to him and also to the mayor. So we sent the film to the mayor of Bragança, a little village in Pará, and also to him. He didn't have a DVD thing. So he bought a DVD, how do you call it? DVD player, to see his own DVD. And the mayor, when he saw the DVD, asked him to come because he became like a reference in this type of thing. So the first network we made, not by knowing it, not by having it as a goal, was the network between the public force and the small farmer. Just because we went there and we made this small film and we showed the film in the US. Then we sent the film to Slow Food on Film Festival, and the film was selected. So there we went to Italy to show about this farmer from Pará, from the Amazon. And this guy was selected to go to Terra Madre, which is the largest meeting of slow food that meets chefs and farmers, and also people from the academy. And this guy, Mr. Benet, was invited to go with us. So I said, second film, this guy going to Italy, to Terra Madre, meeting all those farmers from all over the world and coming back to his place. So we made this second film. Mr. Benet goes to Italy. So this film was selected again to Slow Food Film and also to Berlin Festival. So this film went to Berlin, and all the people in Berlin were really, really emotional about it, and it was a great success. And Mr. Benet knew about it. So this is the kind of network that happens when a chef meets a farmer. I really think chefs are very powerful people nowadays. Not only about the trends, but because people are eating out much more than before. We are replacing emotionally the mothers, the houses. And we are also making changes in trends, in habits. So as we saw yesterday in the film, that Rethink film talks about changing habits. And I think really, really we are in a wonderful, strategic place to make these changes. And I'd like to finish, Leah told about Wendell Berry, which is one of our poets, is an American agricultural poet that says eating is an agricultural act. And this comes like a mantra in our heads. And I started thinking about that, and I said, eating is also an economical act. And now, I believe cooking is a political act. So for me, nowadays I'm really, really proud of what we are doing in Brazil, in Rio. We are the Eco Chefs group from my institute, Institute Maniva, is there, and can give you some folders afterwards. And I think really we are making a change. And it's really, really I'm very glad because we chose the place that some of you went in our field trip to meet those guys, those producers that live in the forest. And I think this is also going to make a big difference in their lives too. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Teresa, for that very powerful presentation. And in fact, all three of you. And I thought it was fascinating listening to all of you talk, because I think certain issues came up again and again. This relationship between chefs and farmers. The fact that actually when we're talking about food, we're talking about people. And the fact that actually, everyone's got food stories. And I thought it was fascinating, Teresa, when you were talking about the emotion that came out when people reconnected with what food really meant to them. I thought that was extraordinary. So, you know, I think this is, I don't know whether any of you want to respond to that, but I also want to throw it up to the floor. But just, you know, the fact that chefs do have this unique opportunity now to make us reconnect emotionally with food, and that is a way of actually making the transition to a more sustainable diet so much more powerful. It's not just an abstract idea anymore. It's actually about love, shall we say.
So I'm not a chef, and so I think that they can answer better than I. But I really think that we can also say that, for example, agriculture is a gastronomic act. And so it's very important, this link between the chef and the small-scale farmers. Because nowadays I think that the chefs are becoming something like opinion makers. And so they have the instrument to make the differences. And so I think that it's very important that now a lot of chefs are trying to be in touch with the local food producer, and are trying to promote local products in their restaurants. And so I really think that the chefs today have a very, very big responsibility. And but here in Rio de Janeiro, all over the world, but in Rio de Janeiro, during these 3 months that we were, trying to know a lot of restaurants and places to make our guide, we met a lot of chefs, young chefs, and chefs like Teresa, she's a kind of pioneers in this link between the restaurant and the farming. But there are a lot of interesting experience here in Rio de Janeiro, but also in São Paulo. And I think that it's very important now that it's in big cities start to develop this new model of gastronomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as I said also in my speech, yes, chefs have an extreme responsibility to do something about it. I mean, I think, but I also think that chefs has a responsibility to tell other chefs that they have to get, look into this, and you can't just call up somebody and source all kinds of things without knowing where it comes from, without knowing the consequences and all of that. That's one part of it. But I also think that it's really important to not only talking about it in restaurants, talking about also in the food writers levels, in schools, in public meals. I mean, we eat 3 times a day. I mean, this is extremely important. We can't live without eating, and most of what we actually eat, we could die of if we ate it all the time. And lots of people do, actually, either of that or hunger. There's so many issues at stake here. So we have to connect to it, and I think powerful stories like Teresa's personal stories and storytelling about food, and because when we think about our grandmothers, when we think about our families and we think about our friends, most of all the best times we've had in our lives have been about sitting down and eating with people we love. And I think that connection is actually a very important part of this story, even though it's climate change and animals and all of that. But that's a core, because that's what life is about.
Absolutely.
Just one thing. Another thing I've been thinking about is that eating is the only consumption act that we have to do every day. Because clothes you can buy and you choose just once and then you can. But food, you have to choose every day.
Yes.
And I think this is really something powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then you can actually, wonder why it has so little value. I mean, that we always think about the cheapest food and how can we buy it even cheaper. And especially in my country, having offers 3 for 1 price and all that in the supermarkets. And that is always something I wonder about, that people would want to eat that. And, if you compare to when they buy a car or mobile phone, they'll never do that. They'll choose the best. So, of course, that is also a very big part of it. We have to understand the extreme value of food. It is really worth something.
The most valuable thing in all our lives, arguably. Yeah.
But I think that also the chef can have a very strategic role in the education, because education is really the most important instrument to fight against hunger and also to promote the better habits regarding food. And so it's very important to involve, for example, chef or also small-scale farmer in educational programs about food in the school, but also adults sometimes need to be educated on that.
One last thing, yeah. Now that our ministers left, but I think politicians have, you should hear this, the government should hear this, politicians have an enormous responsibility when it comes to education, but it's not only about chefs educating. We have to put it into the school system, because we live lives today where family don't teach the children anymore to cook, and it's not natural. It has to be embedded in our culture in a whole new way, and it goes for almost all areas of this world.
I'm sorry we're running a little bit late. We started late. I call it Brazilian time. I hope you're all okay. I would like to invite maybe one or two questions from the floor, because we are, yes, the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. I have Ian Eddington from Australia, here with the trade union delegation. I have two questions quickly. The first one is to the Danish proposal 60-40. Trina, and it was about, it's connected with something you just said. I'd like to invite the chefs to think about how they might convince labelling agencies in the various countries to label food products so you can actually really tell where they came from. I don't know about other countries. In my countries, it's impossible to know. It is so amorphous. So that's the first one. The second one's an awful question, but I do have to ask it. In the past, we've talked about the curse of minerals. If you're a developing country or a small country and you have minerals, what happens when the minerals are exploited? My feeling is now we're sitting on the verge of a second wave, which is to do with the buy-up of agricultural land of some countries by others. And it's my fear that the right to grow our own products will be taken away from us in substantial ways. So I'd invite you and your organisations to deliberate in the years that, in this year, if you could, at your next meeting, to think of ways to counteract or to ameliorate the detrimental effects of those kinds of movements. Thank you.
I mean, if I could respond quickly on the second point, I think that the panel's coming up are going to talk more about those kinds of issues, land grabs and so on, so thank you for that. But anyway,
just about bread and manioc. Like I said, wheat was only brought to Brazil by the Portuguese, the colonizers. Before that, there was only manioc and other tubers. And today, we have an everyday bread. That's an expression. Everyday bread. This everyday bread in Brazil is called French bread, and is made with 80% of wheat that comes from Canada, United States, and Argentina. So we eat everyday food, everyday bread of something that is not culturally related to our past, and also it doesn't grow in our country. So that's the thing.
To the point you said about the land grabbing and that whole thing, I think it's very, very important that we as consumer understand that every time we buy food, we vote with our money. And if we support the 5 big industries we have in this world that more or less control all of that, we support that system. And the best way we can stop that is by buying it somewhere else and buying it in smaller places. But on the other hand, I would love to see a global law say giving a limit to how big a food company were allowed to grow. But there's lots of laws globally we can't pass, but that was one of them that I would really like.
I mean, I think also that buy food is a kind of political act. And so, I mean, farmers really need the right to grow, to own their land. But I think that it's very important and strategic the role of the consumer on that, because they really need to support the small-scale food production. And in the moment that they choose to buy, for example, vegetables in a farmer market, they are doing a political act, because they are demonstrating that they are supporting the small-scale farming, and they choose and they prefer to buy a local food instead of buying an industrial food that is usually coming from abroad. For example, at the beginning that I was, eating a lot in a different restaurant here in Brazil, I discovered that the majority of the fish that the people are eating here came from other places here in South America, especially from Chile. They are eating a lot of salmon came in from Chile. And I was, really surprised, because there is a very big and huge coast here in Brazil. But there are a lot of groups of small fishermen here. There is one, for example, here in Copacabana. It is Colonia de Pescadores. And they are fishing every day, and they are selling there the fish. But only few people know that they are still fishing with traditional fishing techniques. And so, the role of organization like Slow Food and the civil society is to promote this kind of different way to produce and to consume food.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think I'm going to say many thanks indeed to Trina, Leah and Teresa for a fascinating discussion, and we'll move on. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we're now going to move on to the second of our three sessions. And this one we're going to discuss how the cultural shift that we've just been talking about can move on to a broader understanding of the value of ecosystems, those genetic resources, and biodiversity. And I think it's fascinating, again, to refer back to the comment I made at the beginning of this evening about how distanced we're becoming from the issues that surround food. There was a study done in the UK recently by DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, that asked UK citizens what they thought biodiversity was. And the most popular answer coming back from that survey was, it's a kind of washing powder. So I think that just gives you some idea of the horrific distance we have to address. But without further ado, because we've got some wonderful speakers to talk to you about this, I would like to invite up onto the stage Émile Frisson, who's the Director of General Biodiversity International, and he's going to be talking to us about nutrition strategies and ecosystem services and the work that he's doing with biodiversity, which sounds fantastic. Palle Christiansen, who is Greenland's Minister for Education, Research and Nordic Cooperation, to give us an Arctic perspective on what we're talking about. And lastly, Renato Maluf, who's the former president of the Brazilian National Council on Food Safety and Nutrition. And he's going to give us a South American perspective. Thank you very much and welcome to all of you. Sorry, just hand out the names.
Yeah.
So, again, as I say, without further ado, I think I'm going to throw the floor open to Émile.
Thank you very much, and I must say it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. When Mats wrote to me inviting me to participate in this event, I immediately said yes. I didn't hesitate very long, because I think that talking about the relationship between food and biodiversity is one of the most powerful ways to get away from the idea that it's a washing powder, but what biodiversity actually means and what it means to people. But before I reconnect to food, I want to say a little bit on where we come from. You've heard a lot about the gastronomic dimension of the link to food, which of course is the most evident one. But I want to talk about how all these issues relate to food security, hunger, and poverty, and how we can use diversity and different ways of dealing with food to address these problems. Until quite recently, the problem of poverty and especially food security was looked at in a very simplistic way, just about producing more quantity of food, a bigger pile of rice or wheat or maize, with very little attention to other than producing calories, basically. And it's very heartening to see that, at least in the last couple of years, even at those international debates like Rio+20, there finally is more attention to the aspect of the quality of food and what people actually eat. It doesn't go by far as I would like, but I think steps are made in the right direction. So what I'm going to talk about is what is often referred to as the bottom billion people, the people that are hungry every day, people that are living on less than $1 a day. And Biodiversity International, my organization, is an international research organization that is part of a consortium of 15 centers called the CGIAR, which is looking at issues of improving food security, fighting poverty, looking at environmental sustainability, etc. Now, I don't want to just talk about hunger, because there is an equally important problem that is affecting 2 billion people, and that's malnutrition caused by lack of micronutrients and vitamins, and the whole issue about the double burden of malnutrition, where we see that there are a lot of people that are undernourished, that are suffer from hunger, but at the same time, many people, and again, often poor people, are also suffering from the result of a simplified diet, rich in energy, but poor in nutrients. And that is becoming a true global problem. We are seeing the effect of this simplification of diet having impact in developing countries with a tremendous increase in the prevalence of non-communicable diseases that were virtually absent in the past. Diseases like type 2 diabetes, cancers, and cardiovascular disease are now becoming the #1 killers in developing countries, among the poor and middle-income countries. I mean, this is not something that you hear very much talk about, and that is essentially the result of a shift in a nutritional transition, a simplification of diets, where the cheapest food is energy-rich but nutrient-poor. And this is the globalization of the food culture that has this effect. And in some countries, and probably among the most extreme in Kiribati, one of the small Pacific islands, which has basically become totally dependent on imported food. You have now 80% of the population that is overweight, 50% that is obese, and 30% of the population that suffers from severe type 2 diabetes, to the fact that it has become almost a tourism to go to Australia to get amputations as a result of diabetes. So it's really a tremendous public health problem. Now, that's the problem. How can we bring solutions to that? And if today, despite the fact that the world is producing enough food, and the previous speaker has mentioned that it's the problem of hunger and is essentially a matter of, I wouldn't call it distribution, because that gives a top-down image about feeding people. It's about access to food that you don't have the means to buy or produce food yourself. But it is globally, the world is producing enough food. We'll have to produce a lot more in the future, but today still at least we can produce enough. But the issue is who has access to it, who can buy that, and the fact that agriculture and the current predominant agricultural model, which is based on economies of scale, of large-scale production of a few crops. We know that out of the 250,000 plant species that occur in the world, we humans have consumed about 7,000 species in our history, but only 3 crops produce 50% of the calories that the world is consuming. That's rice, wheat, and maize. 50% is produced by just 3 species. Imagine the simplification that has occurred over the last, probably last century. Now, how can we address the issues of poverty, of hunger, in a way that avoids these problems and that really addresses the needs of the poor? And that is really requiring a different look at the relationship between food and agriculture. Agriculture today still represents probably, it's still occupying about 70% of the population in developing countries. Now, in the Nordic countries, probably 1 or 2%, like in most of industrialized countries. But this is still the mainstay of occupation of people, of income of people, etc. But that's also still where the largest number of poor people are living. Out of the 300 million people that live on less than $1 a day, a majority is poor smallholder farmers. And it's really paradoxical that it's also among smallholder farmers that you have most people that are hungry. So that means that the model of agricultural intensification has something inadapted to solving the problem of the poorest. And I think this has now been demonstrated. All the progress made in agriculture hasn't changed the number of poor people nor the number of hungry people. And I think it's not just a matter of not existing extension services in developing countries or a lack of access to other things. It is that the model of agricultural intensification is not answering the needs of the poor. And I think a different model, one that is based on a use of a greater diversity, has the potential to really change that. And that's what we are doing research on, and that's what we are trying to also get a message out. And I think that taking the food approach to explain to people why it is important to change your agricultural model is easier than to talk in abstract about food security and poverty, which is often very distant from people. So what we are trying to look at is a model of agriculture that is based on a broader use of diversity to address different objectives. One, a smallholder farmer that has only half a hectare cannot live just on growing one crop. It's economically not viable, especially because of the major commodities being subsidized and poor people can't compete. Secondly, their objective is not to maximize productivity, but to minimize the risk of failure. A missed harvest or a failed harvest means people die of hunger. And so that's not an option. So resilience and stability in production is very important. The third one is look not only at producing the food, but having a healthy environment, the ecosystem services that are provided by the agricultural systems. The next one is to look at the cultural dimension. I had the example of a development agency that I shall not name coming to Uganda, and the southern part of Uganda, the major staple there is bananas, matoke, and the word for food is matoke, is the name of banana. And so it shows how if people haven't had a meal of banana, they haven't eaten, so it's culturally very important. And somebody come and say, they got their priorities wrong, they should be growing maize because we have this wonder maize that will produce more, etc. And we have to be also culturally sensitive in bringing solutions. And the last one is, of course, the nutritional dimension. And if we don't have a diverse agriculture, you cannot provide a diverse diet that is necessary for healthy life. And so having a different model of agricultural intensification, one that is based on diversity, can achieve multiple benefits in terms of livelihoods, in terms of resilience, sustainability, ecosystem services, the cultural dimension, and nutrition. So I just want to give maybe an example of what is, first of all, the challenge that we are facing in trying to do that, but also that it is possible to change things. And the example I'll give is in and around Nairobi, where in supermarkets and also in many markets on the street, the only green leafy vegetable you could find 10 years ago was cabbage. Now, cabbage has some interesting properties, but I wouldn't say it's a nutritional panacea. And traditionally, in Kenya alone, more than 200 species of green leafy vegetables have been consumed. Many of which were not cultivated, but were picked from the wild. And they don't appear anywhere in nutritional tables or in statistics or surveys that were done, where you only have information about major staples. Sometimes they say this is eaten with the sauce, but that's where all the micronutrients are. And so you don't have information about all that aspect of diversity. We looked at what were some of the locally grown species, traditionally grown species, that could be reintroduced in the market. And we brought together a very wide range of partners from community-based organizations that were working with women groups to train them in improving their lives, to the agricultural research station that was looking at producing quality seed, bringing in the nutrition department of the hospital of Nairobi, the Ministry of Health, a supermarket chain. The major supermarket chain of Nairobi was a partner in the project. And bringing all these people together over a period of probably about 10 years before it really kicked off, we were able to reintroduce a range of different African leafy vegetables that from a nutritional point of view had 10 to 100-fold micronutrient contents compared to cabbage, and were providing livelihoods, better income for the farmers that were producing them, and better quality food for themselves. Now, one of the major obstacles that we encountered is the negative stigma, and I think it was you who mentioned this issue of this is food for the poor. A lot of these vegetables were considered backwards. That's what my grandma used to eat, and I want to be modern, so I eat junk food. Or secondly, it's food for the poor. And therefore, that was a very powerful stigma on these foods. So what we did was really an uphill battle, but we wanted to show that you can change demand. Often people say, well, we have to supply what the market wants. I think that's a very simplistic and easy answer. That's not true. And education can really change the demand. And that involved a whole range of activities. The supermarkets
would provide... quite brief, Emil, sorry, I'm just trying to...
I get so excited when I'm talking about these things.
1 minute, perhaps.
Okay, no, I'll just finish this story and that'll be it.
Okay.
That involved providing recipes. Many people had forgotten how to use these foods. We involved the chefs of the most famous restaurants of Nairobi to produce new recipes, and now they were serving that in their own restaurant. It was introduced in the canteen of Parliament, and we had on TV parliamentarians saying how emotionally they felt about the reintroduction of that. It made them think about their mother, people that were 70 years old talking about that and saying how they were proud to be able to eat that again. So we have different examples in different countries where we've been working on reintroducing diversity in a different model of improving people's lives. And I think in order to communicate the need to do that and how that can be done, to use the example of food and the diversity of food and the link that people have with food is a very powerful message. And that's why I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. It's just, I know 9 minutes is a very difficult amount of time to talk for, but I'm going to ask our future speakers to try to stick to it if they could. So, Pale.
Yes, thank you. In my daily job, I'm the Minister of Education in Greenland, but today I'm glad I'm the one who's being educated by all of you who has made their speeches before me. And compared to what you have been saying, this speech is going to be rather boring because your speeches have been so vivid for me. But dear participants, my ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for me to make a statement on sustainable food societies, which is a very crucial issue for our cabinet and have been a central spot in our policy programs in 2009 when we created the coalition in Greenland. In my intervention, I will give you an example of the way of our government has acted to develop a rural economy on a sustainable basis. Food security is not only a global matter, but also an extremely important local issue. Increased production of local resources should both promote local sustainable development and in the same manner reduce CO2 emissions due to reduction of imported food. First and foremost, our cabinet have advocated intensively for increased sustainable use of all living resources in Greenland based on sound biological advice. We have also advocated the importance of listening to what national, international organizations and unions have to say on a sustainable development in a broad aspect. Greenland is therefore participating actively in regional and international management bodies such as the Nordic Council of Ministers. I would also like to stress the importance of the sound ecosystem-based management for all living resources. In another word, it is important to have a balanced utilization of all wildlife resources before the food ends on the table or at the local or abroad store desks. We are interested in a broad sustainable use, not only biologically, but also economically, and to secure that the products are utilized without any waste. We have seen today that it is rather difficult, but we are trying that very hard in Greenland since we are situated so remote in the high Arctic. Greenland is still dependent on marine resources. Sustainable fisheries is therefore crucial today to increasing demands from the customers to eat seafood that are sustainable, fished and utilized. We have therefore, in cooperation with the industry, worked to gain certified fish resources through the Marine Stewardship Council, which among French is called the MSC mark. In that way, we can assure market that our products and secure acceptable prices for our fishermen. Here I'm referring to the cold water prawn from our sea. We have good indications to reach a certification later this year, which will help us to an economic sound development. I'm proud that our seafood industry have a local and globalized prospect. Seafood production in Greenland and outside Greenland is in an increasing development, which is well known for its pure and good quality products. And this is not meant as an advertisement, but the prawns that we harvest from the sea are so pure compared to what you normally are getting served around in the Western world, where you see those big prawns which are farmed on land and filled with penicillin. And normally in my dental clinic, when I'm a dentist in my civilian job, and I said to some of my patients, if you're really sick and you have a sore throat, eat some of those prawns from the farms because they contain more penicillin than I can give you. So this is not a hidden advertisement for Greenlandic prawns, but please buy them, please eat them, and please enjoy them. Well, the situation is different when we speak about terrestrial and marine mammal. Today we have only one plant that has the authorization to make production of musk ox, both to the local market but also for the little export that we got. Another plant, which is owned by the same company, has authorization to make marine mammal production to the local markets when we talk about seals, whales, whale meat, and what we call matdak, which is the skin of the whale. This geographical challenge has given us something unique too. Due to the isolation and desolate locations of towns in Greenland, local food markets have thrived for decades. Local cuisines becomes a huge factor in helping determine the identities of the various regions in our country. So in that matter, we are very similar to the stories that we have heard from the northeast Brazil and everywhere else. We can just not farm as much as you can. Our season is very, very short. You can harvest 3-4 times a year in some parts of Brazil or Africa or in the east. But we are happy if you can harvest once a year. So some of the numbers that we saw earlier from Trine, where we have to eat a lot of plants and not that much animals, well, that is impossible for us to do that. If we should live by those numbers, we will die simply of starvation. And since we are living that remote, it would also be difficult to us to produce all that food by ourselves. So we cannot provide with 40% of local food, if that is the goal, to be like a global goal. We need to import a lot of things because of where we are living. We cannot grow any fruit by ourselves in Greenland. We don't have, the small farms that we got can only produce food for the sheep. And that's it. And then we eat the sheep. I know that is not very good for the CO2 emissions, but they are very tasty. So what we are trying to do is to create this local and regional food culture and identity, which we are proud of, by using the resources that we have in our communities. And I think that is one of the key elements behind the new Nordic food, which is on the rise these days. And due to the international and intergovernmental trade restrictions and binding conventions, Greenland is not allowed to make export products from large whales. And furthermore, Greenland have self-imposed ban on export of narwhal. The increasing numbers of marine mammals in our seas are the biggest competitors to our fishermen and hunters. We have therefore introduced management plans for all economic important species that we are utilizing in order to secure sustainable use and development. And to give you an example, we have a lot of, I don't know the English name for it, but the German name is bugelwals. In Danish it's pukkelvaler. I don't know the English name for it. But we have so many of these whales in our waters. What? Humpback whales, yeah. And our biologists say that we can easily hunt 10 whales a year, and we will still have the same amount of whales. So this is sustainable. So we applied for the International Whaling Commission to be able to hunt for these 10 whales. But when we talk about big whales, it always becomes a discussion about feelings. When you talk about whales, you don't talk about facts, and that's it. So even though that we can document that what we are doing in Greenland is sustainable with the prawns, with the whales, with the caribou, with the muskox, when it comes to the whales, the IWC say no. So we are in a dialogue, I think our staff called it, but let's see how it ends up. But one thing is that when we are producing the meat that we can in Greenland, we still have one big challenge as well. If you look at the map, when you see the Nordic region, Greenland is half the Nordic region, but we are maybe less than 1% of the population, and we are spread over an area bigger than the Western Europe. And we have 57,000 people living in Greenland. So when we produce food for ourselves, we have to distribute it in such a great area. And when we have to import like 90% of our food, I think you can imagine how the CO2 emission will be just to live in Greenland. Yeah, that was outside the speech that I had. But I hope that by attending this seminar that we can learn a lot of what you have of experiences, and maybe to tell you that when we have seminars like this, it is very, very important that you recognize that when you have some kind of idea and you want to have the rest of the world to adapt to that, you have to keep in mind where those people are living. Because it's easy to say, you have to do this, you have to do that. I agree with that. That should be the global goal. But we have to change it a little bit to fit it so it is usable for everybody. But if not, if we set one common goal and it's unrealistic to reach it, we won't sign that deal. So let's be realistic when we do that. And I think so far we are doing pretty well in this seminar. And regarding our traditional food, it has been evaluated by medical doctors and other scientists. The scientists recommend the Inuit people not to stop eating what we are used to, and not to reduce the amount of meat that we are, and traditional food that we are eating, because these products are healthier than the imported food and the industrialized food. But at the same time, the doctors tell us that this meat from the whales and from the seals, and sometimes from the polar bears, because we eat those as well, they are containing so high levels of pollution from the industrialized world that it could be dangerous to eat big amounts of it. For instance, if you eat polar bear, you are recommended not to give that to kids, because the levels of lead and other things are so high in the meat and in the fat, so it is not good for kids to eat. But it was said earlier that manioc were for the Brazilians the daily bread. Our daily bread is meat. So if you tell us not to eat meat, well, we will starve like many other peoples in the world. But what we would like to do is to find a common solution and work together, both from inside the Greenlandic society, but also with the rest of the Nordic ministers of cooperation, which I also represent here today. And another thing that we should look upon is the dangerous emissions that we have. Everybody's talking about black carbon and all that, but we are letting so many pollutants out in our seas and in the air, and it all ends up in the Arctic regions. So we can measure that in our sea, we can measure it in the rain falling in Greenland, and we can see that in all the animals. So for us, it would also be very useful if we could agree upon how to grow the craft, how to hunt the animals, but also how to manage the pollutants that we produce, no matter what we do. So I will end up pretty fast by saying that to create healthy rural economies, we should start by making healthy local food in sustainable ways. Not just because it's economically profitable, but also because we owe that to our common planet, and we owe that to the next generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so finally, Renato Maluf, to give us a Brazilian perspective. Thank you.
Well, good evening to everyone. Thanks to the organizer for inviting me here. In order to address what's been proposed to me, I decided to highlight some points related to the possibilities and difficulties of having consumption and consumers as drivers for a sustainable rural development, having biodiversity in its very core. This is more or less what I understood I should address. And I will start by proposing that we've been pushing in Brazil well, based in Brazilian experience for sure. And we've been pushing in Brazil the idea of using social biodiversity instead of biodiversity. Because our comprehension is that biodiversity is not only about nature, it's about people, it's about social groups. And I would like to profit from the fantastic story that Teresa told us about manioc. I mean, manioc is not only a root, it's not only a product, But even if you want to take the root, the product, I'm not sure about this number, but I think we have more than 100 varieties. 1,000? Didn't know that. I thought it was 160. But I said, I won't dare say this number because it's too 1,600 varieties. Well, okay, 10 times plus than I thought. So I don't know so much about Maniac as you. Anyway, with this number of varieties, what are these varieties? What does this mean? It means a product which is produced, processed, and eaten by quite different people in a quite different ways. We're talking about social groups, we're talking about culture. So biodiversity is not only about nature, it's about people. It's about the people who create and value the biodiversity. In Brazil, let me go to the possibilities of having consumers and consumption as drivers for a sustainable rural development. Possibilities. First, in Brazil, we've been seeing an increase in fear about the use, or I should say, the abuse of chemicals in our agriculture. People are starting to fear that we've been eating food with poison, or poisoned food. It's more or less what the Europeans felt during the mad cow disease, etc. So, to a lesser extent, we've been seeing also the discussion about the use of GMOs. But the fact is that my hope, and this is why I mentioned this as a possibility, my hope is that by considering the impacts on health due to the use or the abuse of chemicals, the Brazilian society will start by criticizing the agricultural model that we've been pushing here, based on large-scale monoculture. In this sense, in Brazil, as in other parts of the world, the agroecological approach is giving us much help in conceptual terms, in terms of criticizing this model and promoting alternative models based on family farmers, smallholders, peasants, etc. The second possibility, which is also a hope, for bad reasons, but it's a hope, is that overweight and obesity became a social problem, a public health problem in Brazil, as in many parts of the world. Again, through this health approach. I mean, what I'm saying is that the society is not always ready to discuss the agricultural model by its environmental impacts, but for sure they will be in the mood of discussing this by the health impact of this agricultural model. This is my hope. So the fact that obesity and overweight has become a public health problem as important as hunger in Brazil, in percentage terms, that gives me a hope that we would be able to start making the main connection that I think that we should do between nutrition and biodiversity, between healthy dietetics and biodiversity. My third point as possibilities of having consumption as a driver is that, and we've been experiencing this in Brazil, is that the food procurement by government is perhaps one of the most powerful push in terms of promoting biodiversity. And we've been experiencing here in Brazil with 2 or 3 programs that buy food from small producers and pay a different price for those who promote biodiversity. So this is a way of using public money, using public policies, directing public policies towards these people who need markets. And they need this sort of stimulus in order to value the biodiversity that they deal with. So this is for the possibilities. What about the difficulties? Well, we could mention lots of. I've picked up 3. The first one is a more general one. In talking about Latin America, especially in Brazil, there is not even one relevant issue that you could address without talking about social inequality, without taking into account social inequality and poverty. Sort of cross-cutting topic that you have to take into account in no matter which issue you want to address. For sure, I could talk about hunger, which is an outcome of poverty and social inequality, but I don't want to talk about hunger. Alexander has already mentioned it. Everybody knows about this. I mean, let's talk about the other dimension of this social inequality and poverty related to the question I decided to stress here. Social inequality and poverty means that to promote biodiversity or social biodiversity, it's not enough having consumers who behave like this or like that. I mean, the people, I start by saying that biodiversity is not only about nature, it's about people. The people who's supposed to be the ones that promote social biodiversity, they have to have the right to access the natural resources that they need to value the diversity that the nature offers us. But the diversity is there, but the biodiversity to become something that you value, it must be produced. It must be dealt with. And what happens is that most of our social biodiversity is pretty much connected with some social group that don't have the access to land. Their land. I'm talking about indigenous people. I'm talking about black rural communities. Or I'm talking about small farmers also. They don't have access to land or the access to natural resources, even in the Amazon. The collectors of fruits in Amazon, they don't have the access in many cases. So one outcome of this, I'm talking about the many dimensions of social inequalities. I'm not talking only about income. I'm talking about the many dimensions of social inequality. But the aspect of income is also relevant. We all know that we've got this problem of price in consuming more health dietets. Okay, in our case, the price matters. So poor people, they have difficulties in accessing a healthy dietetics because of price, the connection between price and income. The second difficulty I decided to highlight is the absence, it has to do with food sovereignty. It's the absence of national food provision and policies, which promotes just the opposite sort of counter trend in relation to the way the global food system is organized. It's been already mentioned. I mean, it's a counter trend in order to reconnect production and consumption. What the food system made was enlarging the distance between production and consumption. This is all about the local, etc., that many speakers has already mentioned here. We, in South America, or in Latin America, and even in Brazil, as in many parts of the world, we just ended up from a period of the so-called neoliberal adjustment, when we've been taught that government should just get out of the scene, let the market work, let free market work. And we know that this is a fallacy. I mean, there is no free market. If government doesn't regulate the market, the private sector will do it. And this is what they've been doing all the time. And my third and last point has to do with peasants and what we've been calling here the traditional people in communities. Brazil sometimes is a strange country. I mean, since the school, we've been teaching that we are the country of the future. We are the moderns. We are, I don't know, we are lots of things. The only one I believe is that we are the best in football. The other one doesn't matter. But we've been always talking about modernity, just forget about the past, etc. And for 2 years now, we've got a law recognizing traditional people in communities. And with a special program for these people, I'm talking about, I don't know, perhaps 15 different types of traditional people. Coming from the indigenous people. Indigenous here in Brazil has a specific meanings. It's indigenous. It's not local in the sense of more general sense that sometimes people take. No, it's indigenous. They take themselves as original people. So you've got the indigenous people, you've got the black rural communities came from the slavery period, and you've got the fisher folks, you have all this type. So the valuing of peasants and the traditional people in the community is crucial in terms of social biodiversity. Because as it has been already said, social biodiversity has to do with culture, has to do with history and heritage. And these people is, I mean, perhaps the most important part or the most important instrument to promote this cultural heritage that the social biodiversity represents. Okay, these are the three possibilities and the three difficulties I decided to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Admirably succinct delivery as well. Thank you, Renato. I mean, again, I thought it was so interesting that all three of you were talking about people, really. And I mean, it quite often seems like a ridiculously obvious thing to say, but one can talk about food in the abstract and forget that it's actually people and communities and identity that we're talking about. So I think that came across really strongly. And I mean, I think it's fascinating, Palle, that, you know, you brought up, I mean, Greenland, it has to be said, is a country with very particular, you know, conditions and very particular, you know, cuisine and food cultures that relate to that. But it's so useful for us to be reminded that, you know, you can never generalize about food. The only thing that you can say is common is that we all need to eat. But it made me also think, it's interesting, I think, you know, the whole meat question again, I mean, you know, a lot of the issues that surround it are to do with the fact that people could be eating grain rather than the meat that we're eating that's been fed with grain. Of course, if we're talking about seals and whales and polar bears, then that is a completely different issue. And so, I mean, I thought that was a very interesting point to pick up. And, you know, our daily bread is meat, and by the way, meat is not meat. You know, so very, very fascinating set of issues. I think what I'm going to do, because we're sort of running late and I want to speed things up, is to throw these kinds of issues open to the floor for one or two questions, and then if there are any burning questions. Yes.
In your opinion, it's possible to feed the world population with small-scale agriculture, with healthy, I mean, local food, and preserving the social biodiversity, or better, the biocultural diversity, because food is also culture and food is identity. And so promoting the local food production, we are also promoting the rural culture of, I mean, the rural areas where the food is produced.
Does anyone want to? Yes, or another question? Okay. Yep.
Hi, I'm Kira. I'm from Denmark, and I work with the Ministry for Gender Equality. So I've got a different perspective on this, because we've heard today excellent presentations on, I've written it down, food, climate change, production, diversity, energy, consumption, technology on the one hand, then we've got love, and we've got consumers on the other hand. And what we want to do is that we want to address consumption and food, and we want to actually change people's behavior in the future to be able to be sustainable. But we can't just talk about consumers or love without actually talking about women and men. Because what we've realized is the fact that women and men are completely different as consumers. For instance, within many of the Nordic countries, men eat 139 grams of meat every day. Women eat 81. So if we do want to change something, we have to address this. Also, we've realized that when we actually talk to women and men about changing behavior, about green economy and things like that, women are actually more apt to realize that, okay, I want to change something. I want to listen. I want to be able to change my life as a consumer. So has that ever appeared to any of you when you're talking about these issues, that we actually need to attack women and men as different consumers in the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that throws a kind of nice kind of boomerang into the conversation. But do any of you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Renato? Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, my answer is yes, it's possible. The mistake, it's not a mistake. I mean, it has to do with business. What these people, this green revolution people and GMO people, what they used to do, they transfer to the future the present situation and say, okay, in 2050, we're going to be 9 billion. For feeding 9 billion, we're going to need, I don't know how many millions tons of food, so let's go for more techniques, more of the same model. And this is a trap. This is really a trap. I'm not saying that you could move towards another model just like that. I mean, we need to talk about transition. And somebody has to pay for this transition, because transition costs. European people know about this. Sometimes they've been promoting sort of transition by paying. Taxpayers say, okay, let me pay to change. I'm not saying that worked quite well, but in some places it works. So this is a question. And as I was telling, I was saying before, in our case, in South America, Brazil, etc., in third world countries, we've got this problem of income and social inequality. Who is able to pay? And who is demanding this? It's interesting because here, the main social sector that demands change are the farmers, not the consumers. The small farmers, for sure. Not the big business, not the agribusiness, who are making lots of money with these exports, etc. I mean, there are many Brazils. I'm talking one side of Brazil. So my answer is yes, provided that you've got political will to change, and in part of this political will is having money to fund the transition to more local systems, etc. And without projecting to the future the same consumption pattern that you have now. By the way, nobody mentioned this in talking about consumption. One of the main recommendations we should start by saying is that developed countries should reduce their food consumption if we are to face climate change, etc. Reduce, because an important part of the food consumption in developed countries are waste. Is waste of food. And to come to the point of that you mentioned, you know, I was wondering about talking about gender in my presentation when I was just making the scale. I decided not. I mean, but you're right, absolutely right. And it's not a matter of the future, it's a matter of now. And I'm glad to realize that this gender question in food is becoming more and more relevant in the many roles of women in relation to food. Because you should never forget that, I don't know about your country, but here in South America or in Africa, women represents now an important share of food production. They are responsible to produce. I'm talking about rural women. So these many roles of women in relation to food is crucial. It's really crucial.
Do either of you have a... Yes? Go ahead. Palle.
Well, I'm not that much into the context about the food and culture, but I think that the answer to both of you is that if you look at the gender equality and the culture, this is part of the same thing, I guess. But if you want to change the habits of the people, I think you have to address men and women differently. You can see that in all kind of commercials, all kind of public relations. They're different if you want to have the attention of the men or the women. So I think you have to think of that when you try to change the habits. But it's going to be a very difficult task. I know that if you want to change the way that we eat in the Arctic regions, it's going to take you one very good employee with public relation, I guess. but then again, is the problem that we eat too much meat? Is that the problem in the world, or is it that we are too many people in the world? Many of those problems that we discuss in Rio and anywhere else is due to that we are too many people on the earth. We could have all these bad habits if we were less people, but it's a very difficult and very political incorrect thing to say in all assemblies. But now it's said.
Well done. The elephant finally gets a mention. Yeah.
I think that the issue, I think, can we feed the world with smallholder farmers? I don't think it's a realistic question because in the industrial world we've gone so far. I mean, in industrialized countries, 1% of population is involved in agriculture. To reverse that to smallholder agriculture, I don't think is a realistic proposition. I think we can do a lot in reconnecting and increasing and supporting smallholder farmers. I think doing completely away with larger scale agriculture, I don't think it's very realistic. I think this would maybe a nice proposition. But what we certainly can do is for those areas where smallholder agriculture is a reality today, and that's the case in many places in Africa, in poorer areas of Asia, in some areas of Latin America, I think we should do what we can to make those smallholder farms viable options and allow them to develop. And that requires different policies, but that is perfectly possible. And I think they can not only feed themselves, which they can't do today, but they can also be a contributor to surplus and to markets for the urban population. So I think there is a lot that can be done. Saying that everything can be done by smallholder farmers, I don't think is a realistic proposition. On the gender question, I couldn't agree more. I already talked too long, but if I wanted to talk about the role of women, not only in the food choices, but also as farmers, as has been mentioned, in Africa, about 3/4 of the food is produced by women. Women are, in many cases, the custodians of diversity. They have a particular role in maintaining traditional varieties and the traditional knowledge associated with that. So I think that has to be recognized if we want to engage, and we very much do so in our work in research. We have a very much a gender disaggregation approach to ensure that we don't talk to men about things that actually is the preserve of women, and that's a very big part of the cake. And of course, in nutritional choices, it's even more important because it's the women that basically decide what goes into the kettle, and that has to be recognized. I think maybe one remark about something that was said earlier very briefly. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all, and I couldn't agree more with the minister when he says, don't ask people in Greenland to become vegetarians. I think that's not a realistic proposition. Even, and studies have been done, you mentioned that doctors are saying it's healthy for Inuits to continue to have their diets. There are tremendous linkages between the traditional diets and the people's physiology. If you give a vegetarian regime to an Inuit, they would die, and vice versa. If you give an Inuit regime to a vegetarian in India, they would die too. So there is a tremendous link, not only culturally between the diversity, but also physiologically between the people and the territory in which they live.
Thank you very much, Renato. Just a quick follow-up.
No? I see. Just to add two quick comments. First, perhaps the question of the smallholders, we should pose it in different ways. It's not that difficult. Let me tell you, the international trade accounts for less than 20% of the food we eat. And even in the case of Brazil, who is known to be the great exporter, one of the great food exporters of the world, it depends on the product, but in average, 70% of what we eat here comes from the family farmers. So it's not that difficult. It's possible. The second is, let me just to be clear, I'm not, when I mentioned that developed countries should reduce their consumption, I was not asking Americans to stop having hamburgers. I'm not that crazy. But I'm sure there is a way of having hamburgers with less waste and without becoming that obese as they are. So it's about this I'm talking. I'm not imposing any habits no matter which people.
I mean,
but it's clear that we have food waste in the world, and this accounts for a large part, an important part of food demand.
I mean, there has to be a relationship with the fact that there are 3,900 calories of food available to every American every day, and the fact that they waste, they're the biggest wasters in the world, 50% of the food they produce is wasted. They're two aspects of the same problem, aren't they?
We are moving fast towards that.
In that way. I'd love to go on having this discussion, but I'm afraid I think we're going to have to move on. So huge thanks to Renato, Palle, and Emil. Many thanks indeed. So much.
Thank you very much.
So now to our final session, and sad news but good news in an odd sort of way is that Alexander Müller, our first scheduled speaker, is unfortunately, well, he was caught in traffic about an hour ago, so maybe he's still caught in traffic, but anyway, he's not coming is essentially the issue. So we just have two speakers left for our final session, so I'd like to welcome them both to the stage. Johan Unninger, who is the CEO of Saltokvern in Sweden, thank you. And he's going to tell us about that project and give us a perspective, a business perspective, on strategies for achieving sustainable food societies. And last but not least, and she was scheduled for the first session, so many thanks to her for hanging in there, we have Cecily Tenfjord Toftby, a member of the Swedish Parliament, who's going to talk to us about political aspects of consumer policies and rural development and give us a Nordic Council approach. So many thanks indeed. And if I could invite, maybe I'll invite Cecilia to speak first since you've been made to wait so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually looking forward to being the last speaker.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To talk about all the good things at your birthday. Come up? No. Come up. No. See if we can do anything about it. Better now? Oh, now you hear me. Thank you very much. As I said, I was actually looking forward to being able to have the last words in this very interesting debate. I'm not only a member of the Swedish Parliament, I'm also a member of the Nordic Council. That means that I even represent Palle, whom I thought had very interesting perspective on today's debate, because even though we are Nordic countries, and we maybe represent a very small part of the world, we are very different when it comes to being able to grow and harvest from our farms. And as Trina said, when you were talking about the Nordic countries, I live in Sweden today, but I'm brought up on the Norwegian west coast. And what we ate there was a lot different from what I'm eating in the city of Borås, where I live today. I ate, as Palle has done, a lot of whale meat, because my grandfather was a whaler. I ate a lot of fish a lot of sheep, and a lot of potato. That was what I was brought up in, and I feel very healthy today. So I think even though maybe Norway is lacking a little bit in biodiversity, we have had a lot of good food, and we still do. So and I know everybody's getting hungry now, and everybody wants to taste your good food, Trine, so I will try it to be as brief as possible. Sustainability, food, and regional development, these are important words that can make a great difference for the livelihood of many people if we apply them wisely. I am a politician, so I should try to use what I've heard here today, bring it back, and use these words wisely. The secret behind making a word to a real thing is to be able to adapt it into local reality. And how do we make our everyday life into a sustainable one? I think that is what we have been talking about today. How can I, as a single person, make an impact? How can we exploit our resources sustainable? And how can we create new opportunities for businesses and development? Because I think that is what you have been doing in such a marvelous way. Our societies are becoming more and more urbanized. In Brazil, as well as in the Nordic countries, more and more people are living in the cities. I do not think it's my business as a politician to tell people where to live, but I do think that we should try to make an impact so that they make the right choices. It's a nice way to say it. I do believe that the individual should have and has a great freedom in deciding how their lives are to be. But as a politician, I also have a responsibility when it comes to promoting sustainable development, both when it comes to how you live and how we exploit the Earth's resources. Nutrition is our primary need. We all need healthy and nutritious food to live good lives. No food, no life. However, food is more than nutrition. Food is also culture, it enriches our lives, and it gives us pleasure. And I don't know who was talking about it, when we're talking about family and tradition and inheritance. I was thinking about my grandmother, who every Tuesday came to visit us, and on Tuesday she made a meat and vegetable soup on sheep and potatoes. On Wednesday she made potato rolls made of potato and rye. And on Thursday she took what was left and made a lapskaus, which is probably leftovers. But even though it doesn't sound very tasty, it brought back so many good memories, not maybe about the food, but about what the food represented, and that is so important. Cooking is transferring our resources from our land and oceans into nutrition. The art of cooking gives additional benefits to nutrients, cultural, aesthetical, and, as I said, socially. Good food raises spirits, it improves our spiritual as well as our physical well-being. It nurtures our self-esteem, and it creates respect. It is an expression of local climate and soil, light and rain, history and traditions. What it's really all about is to see new opportunities within the traditional areas of agriculture, forest industries and fishing. How to use the resources that we have in order to create more efficient food production, improve the quality, better use of our biodiversity, as Trine so well spoke about. It also is about what Denmark's Minister of Energy spoke about, is to increase the energy efficiency and minimize the waste. The waste we do produce, I think, should be used into creating new products, such as clean energy for housing and for car fuel. The challenge is to find a way to make the different parts link together in a sustainable chain. My grandfather, as everybody else has said today, would probably ask me, if you heard me say this, and say, is there any other way? Many of the answers can be found in the traditional but often forgotten small local economies. The question we should ask today is, how can we take these local solutions and make them global? And I think more politicians should have been here today to listen to you, because you have been giving us example on how to do this, how to make local small economies and make them global. A functioning chain can solve problems and it can create new opportunities. In the Swedish parliament, I have a colleague. He's a member of parliament, but he's also a fisherman. His name is Rune. And Rune is doing this without even knowing it, I think. Because he's a fisherman, he lives on a small island outside Stockholm, and he could have exported the fish he catches, but he doesn't. Instead, he handles the fish on place, he creating jobs in the process, and then he serves the fish at his local restaurant where his wife is the chef. Very good food. And by doing that, he creates more jobs and also drawing people to this local community, strengthening the community, making a good economical growth, and also giving them a pride in showing off their identity. What Rune even does is to minimize the food transports, decreasing the amount of energy consumed, and because he knows how much fish is needed in his restaurant, there's very, very little food waste. And it's very good, and I think it seems so easy. And why doesn't everybody do it? Ways of modern production is often big scale, as you said, and is concentrated to certain areas, and we are very often dependent on very long transports. And what we do experience in the Nordic countries right now, I think as well as in Brazil, is that the consumers are now demanding local food, both because they see it as itself as valuable, but also because we experience a growing awakening when it comes to environmental issues. And even though the agricultural politics of the Nordic countries differs, I can think we can hear that when we listen to Greenland. I myself do know the Norwegian agricultural politics, which is very subsidized. So we do differ, but we still have a lot in common. And I think what the ministers of the Nordic countries are doing right now is coming to an understanding that this is a development that has to be supported. Local food is good, both when you eat it and when you want to create strong local economies. And I am very proud to be a part of this work, both in the Swedish parliament and even as a member of the Nordic parliament. And even though I'm not active as a local politician now, I do recognize and I'm very familiar with the issues and discussions when it comes to food in this local schools. But unfortunately, very often this discussion ends in how many days a week should we have vegetarian food, and not anything about how the food is grown and what kind of nutrition we find in it. But what everybody has been saying here today is that we are not doing anything new. What we are to be talking about today has been done for generations. And it is only our last generations that has forgotten the good solutions. We have lost them out of sight. And I think it's time for me as a politician, for you as chefs, and for everybody else who is here to make old ways into new winnings. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Cecily. I'm sorry to deprive you of the last spot, but that was a fantastic summary of many of the issues that we've discussed today. So, last but definitely not least, I'd like to invite Johan Onenga to speak.
Can you give my presentation?
Oh.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here. I guess I am supposed to be the business representative here this evening. I'm not sure if that's such a good choice, though, because in fact I am really a long-haired environmentalist. But at least that's what was the case a long time ago. I was involved in all imaginable environmental organizations. Somehow it made me a little frustrated, and then I come to realize that business has a very interesting role when it comes to changing the world. And it's really, the driving force is really passion and the will to do something within business, in real business, I should say. So I've been working as a consultant for business, and now the last 10 years as the managing director of Salto Kvarn, which is a company 50 kilometers south of Stockholm. It started almost 50 years ago as a mill, a biodynamic mill and a bakery, and now we import also products from all over the world, in fact. And our vision is we are a small company, but we want to save the Baltic. The Baltic is 10 countries around the Baltic, or 9 in fact, and 90 million people living around the Baltic. And whatever we do ends up in the Baltic, and it's a very fragile sea because it's brackish, and the organism living there doesn't really want to be there. Either they come from a lake and they don't like the saltiness of the brackish sea, or they come from the sea and they don't like this environment. So it's really a fragile environment, and now it's really threatened by farming, I should say. 50% of the threat comes from the farming system that we have. And what is the problem then? Well, if we go back 100 years, and we visit a farm in the Nordic countries, we can be sure that there was a diversity of production, so to say. They had grain production, they had animals at least on the farm, and you could say that there was some kind of balance. But through specialization, you became either a grain farmer or a milk farmer or a meat farmer. And then this organism was sort of disconnected. And here, as a grain farmer, you had problem well, eventually you had problem with pests, but luckily there was a man in Germany with a scientist. He got the Nobel Prize 1948 because he discovered you could kill all these bugs with DDT. It's not one of the most, the Nobel Committee is not one of the most proud prizes they have, but that he did. And since then on, of course, chemistry has been one of the most important subjects if you are a farmer. But also you have the problem with fertilizers. The cows and the animals gave the fertilizers to the fields, but now they have to import that. And most what they do, the grain farmer, most what the grain farmer do in Sweden, 80% goes to the animal farm, is exported, so to say, to the animal farm, probably in some other part of the country. And from there you have an enormous leakage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on. And what we want to do then is to introduce another farming system. It's an organic farming system, but we do this together with a project in Järna, where we are, called the Beras project, where we want to combine the grain and the animal again. So not only should it be organic, it should be a balance between grain production and animal production, and a more diverse production on the farm. And then you end up having a much less leakage from nitrogen, for instance, up to 70% better than a conventional farm. At the same time, we are introducing voluntary things to do to increase biodiversity, to improve what the farmer is influencing the climate, for instance. There is a organization in Stockholm called Stockholm Resilience Center, and they have developed a model called planetary boundaries. And we have now a toolkit for the toolbox for the farmer to ensure that he stays within the planetary boundaries, and they can have points. In more activity they do, the more points they get, and we pay them more. I will try not to be too technical about this, because I think you are, like me, hungry right now, and we want to. But this is the Beras project then, and the Beras project is then, the aim is to establish this kind of ecological recycling farm around the Baltic. And there are a number of project centers now developing around the Baltic. Another problem we have, of course, is if this is the production, then we have the consumer. I should say the biggest problem we have when we look at the consumer is the disconnection from how the food is produced. In our country, in a company that I work in, we have used social media a lot to start to develop that. That's one tool we have to start to have a discussion with the consumer of how is the food produced and so on. But also, what I would like to come to now is the sustainable food, so the idea of the sustainable food society. And it's really interesting to be working in a place like Järna, 50 kilometers south of Sweden. It's a terrific place where that's been going on for since the 30s, in fact, with a biodynamic center, a center for agricultural education, and so on. And there are all more than 70 different activities in relation to farming, in relation to producing of food, in relation to selling food, and so on. And they are now all combined in this sustainable food society, working together in the Beras project, and also with the aim then, with the fundamental aim of trying to save the Baltic. And here, that's how it's defined then. By connecting the farms to other parts in this whole chain, we are trying to establish this kind of sustainable food society. And there are also learning centers for consumers and farmers that are active on the same spot, so to say. We meet every day, in fact. And this is a more general picture of that, with the farm in the center at least, and all these different activities come. This is now what we are trying to build around the Baltic, and there are numerous of centers around the Baltic. I think, how many are they now, Jostein? 20 centers like this, like the Järna ambition then to build sustainable food societies. And being in business, is this profitable? Because, as I wanted to say, when we look at business, earlier you could say what was good for business was good for society. But I think we have to turn that around as a business, in the business sector. We really have to say what is good, what we do that is good for society is good for business. So it has to be turned around. And this thinking has at least been very good for Salt och Kvarn. We have had a very strong growth in sales. And so it's not a sacrifice to do good. It's really something you can do and at the same time make a profit. But we should be purpose maximizers, not profit. We need profit, but we need to look at the purpose. Why are we here? What are we do as a business? And when the sort of profit motivator becomes untied from the purpose motivator, bad things happen in business. And we try to put it together, the purpose motivator and the profit motivator. They have to be linked. I did the fast version here. I hope you don't mind. I think
Love
you are,
it.
I think you are like me, hungry, but you're welcome to ask questions. So,
Fantastic.
yes.
Thank you, Johan. Wonderful. A chairman's dream. So fantastic presentations to finish up with, and both of you, I thought you really sort of pulled together many of the issues we've been discussing today, the fact that, you know, food is about people, and it's also about thinking positively and asking the question, why are we bothering to do this? It's not just about the food, it's actually about a vision for how we should live. So I think those were both they brought us back to the nub of the point very nicely. Because we are all running behind, I'd love to throw it open to the floor straight away and maybe take two or three questions, and then we can have those as a sort of wrap-up debate, if anybody has any. Yes, one here.
Hi, I'm Arthur, Brazilian. And since you spoke about the role of the enterprise in the business community, why, how, let me just English up here. Why do I need another force to stimulate a local economy? Because here in Brazil, we eat normally seasonal food because of the prices. I normally eat only mangoes at the end part of the year because that's when we have it, and it's cheaper to buy this way. So you see, it's good. Why do I need another force besides the market? That's what I question since from the beginning of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want? So the question, as I understand it, is why do we need another way, you know, of affecting how we eat? Because the market actually does the job. Okay, I think some of the previous speakers would have loved to have addressed that question, but anyway, do you have a response to that?
I think one of the speaker earlier was talking about that what we eat today is 50% of what we eat today is rice, wheat, and corn. And I think even though you eat mangoes, a lot of the world doesn't. A lot of the world has to import, and as Trine said, rye used to be a very important part of the Nordic consumption, but it isn't today because we have gotten used to eating other vegetables and other goods that isn't produced close to us. So I think what we do need today is a new awakening, or what I would call a hallelujah moment, when we can revitalize old traditions forgotten and find new business opportunities within them.
Yes, and I would say in Sweden at least, this is the question about knowledge. It's a dividing line, so to say, which was earlier you could talk about different classes, so to say, of people, but now I would say it's much related to knowledge, how you eat and what kind of food you eat. So the idea of working in schools and so on is, of course, very important. And education is very important. And also, of course, a problem with business is of course, the idea is also to make money. I shouldn't sort of, and if you talk about organic farming, and there are more money unfortunately, there are more money to be made in conventional farming, big scale conventional farming. That's absolutely the case. That is then important for the consumer to understand. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I think, well, the issue of the relationship between, you know, the free market and food is really the big issue that we're discussing here today. And, you know, we can see that if you leave food up to the free market, you get this kind of the industrial paradigm, which, you know, is probably destroying the planet faster than any other human activity. So that's my view on it. But anyway, yes. Gentleman over there. There should be a travelling mic, I think, coming your way soon. Or you could just speak, shout.
Thank you. To address the problem, actually, of this free market and everything, isn't there a role for urban agriculture to actually address all the issues, climate change, culture, connecting people with food locally sourced and everything? And we talk here about new rural economy, but there's also possibly an urban economy, which is starting. And I think it's starting a new paradigm as well. Can you actually expand on that?
You're looking at me, so yeah. No, you're looking at me.
You first.
Yes, I think it's very important because of this knowledge thing and this connecting and what you see, I think, in the United States now. I saw a presentation about that. It's very interesting, where sort of you can find farms on very strange places, very unconventional places, I should say. And I think that's very important and it's one way of connecting again to how food is produced and so on. So you can really, I think, establish sustainable food societies in New York. Obviously, you can.
Including in the White House garden.
Yeah, including in the White House garden, yes.
What I think is important, I am in the Swedish Parliament. I work mainly with the matters of energy. And I see what's happening on energy markets is that people consume it, but they don't know how it is produced. And I'm working very much with making people aware that if you consume fossil fuel, it has a whole other effect on the global climate than if you use biogas, for example. And I think what we have to do the same when it comes to food consumption. You have to make people realize where the food comes from, because if you realize that, you can make wise choices, smart choices. My 2 sons are raised in the city. I do hope that they know where the beef comes from or where the hamburger comes from. I try to teach them that, but as you said, education, that is the clue, that is the answer to a lot.
I read a survey recently that said only 40% of children in the UK know that eggs come from hens, and another 40% thought they came from cows. So there's such an unbelievable disconnection. It's
yes, and
yeah.
you have to teach. We have to teach children how to connect the dots. We have to make the children see how things are connected. And if we don't teach them that, who's going to do it?
Another example is, of course, when Jamie Oliver taught or showed the children how strawberries grow, and they didn't dare to eat them because it looked so strange on the plant, picking them from a plant, so they didn't dare to eat them because of that. So, of course, we have some
big issues.
Yeah, big issues.
I will bring the issues back with me, and as a politician, both in Sweden and in Nordic countries, I will do whatever I can. But, well, I shouldn't give any promises. It isn't an election year this year.
Fantastic. I think because we're running so late, and many thanks indeed for your patience, I'm just going to wrap up. I think it's been a really fantastic evening, wonderful speakers, many, many thanks. I think there have been some really clear themes that have gone through all the speakers, and I would say, one of the strongest, and I suppose, again, it's obvious, is that whenever you talk about food, you're talking about people, and you're talking about, the way we live on the planet, and, we can't generalize. I think Paula, made that point very clearly. But on the other hand, food is this thing that brings us, connects us so powerfully together. And I think it is emerging as a really effective, collaborative tool. I mean, I've been almost stunned, actually, and really delighted to hear so many politicians talking so positively tonight about wanting to incorporate food in their agenda and in policy. I mean, that's really exciting to me. That's new in my experience. So that's really, really wonderful. I mean, I also, so many quotes that I, thought were wonderful. Purpose maximizing, the idea that chefs are the new mothers. I think the whole issue of women's role in this is fabulously, important as well. And the fact that food is just such a positive medium for dealing with these kinds of issues. I think that came through so strongly today as well. It's about enjoyment. It's about taste. It's about the good life. And finally, I think, I often say we're entering a neo-geographical age. In other words, we have to take geography into account again. And I think, as you were saying, Cecily, the fact that old traditions, and so many people, Teresa talked about it very powerfully as well, and so did just now Johan, old traditions are the old new in a sense, and we're having to rediscover things that our grandparents knew very, very well. And I think, it's not looking backwards, but looking forward. So with many, many thanks to all of you, and inviting you once more to now go rise up to the top of the building to taste the fabulous food that I'm sure you've been all imagining and salivating over for at least 2 hours. Many thanks indeed to the Nordic Council of Ministers and to all of you.
Just one quick comment. I'm Michael from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and I'm sorry. One quick last famous word here. Michael Funch from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and for those of you who have stayed on this long, we decided to torment you a little longer. So we would like to actually add one of our other activities here in Rio, where we are trying to sort of gauge the attitudes to sustainability. So we made a campaign called Donate a Word, where we're asking people to think about what is sustainability, what is human, what is nature, all these issues that have been discussed today, actually. And then you can go to a website and donate a word. And we made a short movie. It's only half an hour. It's only 3 minutes, actually. So we would like you to watch that, and then you'll be given a postcard as you leave, and we hope that you will donate a word and share this, because we want input from the whole world to try and see what people really feel about all this sustainability.
Thank you for watching.